So if you've joined the show before, you will know that I am a big fan of GitHub and GitHub Actions. With GitHub Actions as a world-class CI/CD platform, it's never been easier to automate your software workflows from build through to test and ultimately to a deployment. And when you couple that with .NET Core, which can deploy to any platform, it's never been easier to deploy your applications and your workloads to the cloud. So I am thrilled to be able to bring Isaac Levin onto the show today as we talk all about accelerating .NET to Azure with GitHub Actions. Hello there and welcome back to another episode of Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and here we talk about all things cloud. So thank you again for joining today's episode, and I do have a confession to make. You may have already seen the episode appear on YouTube. We did do that live, but unfortunately I had some issues at the very beginning of the episode with the live stream and the recording. So the introductions and those pieces were cut, unfortunately, so doing a re-record here. But I have to say you are in for an absolutely amazing session. So as I mentioned in the intro there, I am joined by Isaac Levin, who talks all about GitHub Actions, using .NET Core and deploying your workloads to Azure. It's an area he's super passionate about, being a .NET developer by background and now working as a senior product marketing manager at Microsoft, and is very involved in some of the keynote pieces. For example, you may have seen his work around the presence light at Build last year. So absolutely awesome and very thrilled to have Isaac on the show. So let's go ahead and jump over and introduce Isaac.
Specifically app dev for Azure. So I care very much about developers using Azure, getting the best out of Azure, right? So that's kind of me, like in a really, really high level. I was a .NET developer through and through for the first part of my career. And this is my first, I guess you could say, like it's a non-developer sort of role, but I definitely do a lot of development and a lot of technical things. And as you'll probably see from this talk, I love .NET, I love Azure, and I especially love GitHub Actions.
And I think we've got the perfect mix of things in this talk today then to to go with that. So I guess then, GitHub Actions, I think is this technology in this set of topics, right, that has really sort of grown over the past few months or so, and probably the past year or so. I think even just before Christmas we got some new features in GitHub Actions. So where's best for us to start? Where do we start the conversation here today?
I can just start my presentation. I do a little bit of an intro on GitHub Actions and kind of how we get started, or if you want, we can just chat about GitHub Actions. I can toss away the presentation and do some demos. It's really up to you, my friend.
Let's maybe start off with the presentation, just in case anyone's not used GitHub Actions before, and then we can do a little bit of maybe questioning in the way, if you like.
Certainly.
So let's jump across. There we go.
Yeah. So, all right. So you can see my screen good?
Absolutely. Looks good to me.
All right. Cool. Also, one thing that I forgot to call out is that I do frequent Twitter and Twitch. So my handles there are Isaac R. Levin, which is the same as my GitHub. What you'll see all the things that you see in this presentation, in the demos, they're all available. I'll provide a one link at the very, very end, which is basically an aggregated link list of all the stuff you're going to see. So if you feel like you're not following along or I'm going a little bit too fast, you can definitely take a look at some of our assets and we'll go from there. Sweet. So kicking off in the beginning, well, not really. So, how did we get apps to production before this whole continuous integration, continuous delivery deployment thing, right? So when I first started, I've only been in tech or professionally for about 12 years. And, there was tools there, but I always remember people telling me about being able to copy paste, right? So you'd be able to RDP in or maybe even, access it via Explorer, your production servers, and you would do all your builds locally, or maybe you'd have some other machine that you would do builds on that was maybe a bit more powerful. And then you would literally Control C, Control V, maybe with some, I guess you could say, things in the middle, some approvals and things like that. But at the end of the day, it was about moving things from one place to another in a manual way. And then eventually people moved to FTP because they were fancy, right? I think one of the things that's very, very interesting about FTP is that it's glorified copy paste as it pertains to the actual mechanism. And there has to be a better way than doing that, right? So as things started to develop and as we got more mature as it pertains to getting our code to places, tools started to show up, but they weren't linked to where your code was, right? One of the big tools that I first started when I first started being a developer was cruisecontrol.net. So folks who don't know cruisecontrol.net, it's a really, really awesome tool that they use webhooks and other mechanisms to basically do CI and CD, right? And you can configure it to your heart's content. It was all but it was very complex. I think one of the things to call out, and that was one of the first, ideas of this concept of continuous integration for .NET apps. And then you had apps like Hudson or softwares like Hudson, which was an open source kind of full CI/CD utility. Hudson, as folks probably guessed, because just based on the avatar, it became Jenkins. So folks who don't know what Jenkins is, it's a very, very well-known CI/CD tool. It's used by a lot of people, not just for .NET, but for all sorts of different programming languages. And as we get closer and closer to today, we talk about, complete CI/CD tools that have linkage to repositories, or they have direct webhooks to repositories. Things like Octopus Deploy and Visual Studio Team Foundation Server. Visual Studio Team Foundation Server, for everybody who's not aware, that was the Azure DevOps before it was Azure DevOps, right? Azure DevOps Server for Team Foundation Server, and Azure DevOps for Visual Studio Team Services. So where are we today? So I'm going to talk about GitHub Actions for a quick second, about the high level things about what a GitHub Action is and why we should care about it. Because one of the things that when I always talk about GitHub Action with people, they kind of just, okay, so it's a GitHub thing. GitHub is for code. Why is there other things too? So GitHub Actions are a YAML-powered workflow linked to GitHub repositories. So what exactly does that mean? So think of it like this. I have a code base, and I want to run particular actions or workflows on that particular code base. I have the ability to do all sorts of different things. However, I want to be able to store that configuration in that code base, because as we all know, GitHub repositories is where the world develops, right? So YAML is yet another markup language syntax workflow, right? So it allows us to store off our configurations and our integrations and deployments in a way that allows anybody to use. And when I say workflows, what exactly does a workflow consist of, and what does it trigger? We'll talk about what it consists of in a bit, but the biggest thing is you can trigger webhooks on a handful of different ways. So using webhooks, you can schedule them using cron jobs, or you can trigger them using manual events directly through the GitHub portal. So when I say webhooks, there are a plethora of different webhooks. The most notable ones are, actions that are done on a repository, like pushes on a repository or pull requesting in a repository. Those things actually can trigger your workflows. That's great, Isaac. But I have this workflow, where does it run somewhere? Do I have to run it on my machine? No. So GitHub has two options, right? So GitHub has this concept of runners. So you can have a GitHub hosted runner, which is basically like a cloud VM that is pre-installed with all sorts of awesome tools like the Azure CLI and the GitHub CLI and .NET and all these sort of tools that allow us to be more proficient as developers right there. So the GitHub hosted runners are provided to you by GitHub. You can also configure self-hosted runners. GitHub provides a base image for you to utilize. And then what you would do is you just point your action to your self-hosted runner and go from there. One of the things that's really, really great about GitHub hosted runners is that they come in the three main flavors of operating systems. So Windows, Linux in the form of Ubuntu 20.04 and Mac OS. So regardless of what kind of app you're building, if you have requirements but as it pertains to operating system, you have that right out of the box with GitHub hosted runners. One of my favorite things about GitHub Actions is the fact that all the logs are available inside the GitHub repo portal. So the same place where you look at your code, the same place where you look at issues and pull requests, you also see the actions being run. And you can go back and see historical context and logs of all the different actions that you've run. And then finally, community is a huge deal to GitHub. So the ability to create actions and workflows for nearly every need and put it in a community marketplace where people can just leverage them. I have actions that are hosted in the marketplace, and that, so does the Azure team. So there are lots and lots of, and we'll go through some of the different actions that exist. But anybody, regardless of their affiliation with a company or affiliation as a developer, you could be a Node.js developer and create a community action. We're going to talk about .NET for the most part for this, but GitHub Actions are completely agnostic as it pertains to operating system and programming languages, right? You specify the operating system, and then you just do whatever you want. So if you need to run some bash scripts, or you need to run NPM, or build a Java app with Maven, you have the ability to do so. But for this talk, we're going to talk about .NET. So now that I mentioned kind of what GitHub Actions are and what the core principles of a GitHub Action is, I want to talk about why .NET developers should take full advantage of GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions, there is one for .NET called setup-.NET. And what setup.NET does is it gives you a completely configured .NET CLI environment. So what does that exactly mean? So GitHub Actions, the runners, have .NET 5 already pre-installed on them. However, you might want to configure a little bit differently. Maybe you want to use a preview version. Maybe you want to use a specific channel of .NET. You have the ability to do that using setup.NET and configure your environment the exact way you want it. Maybe you want to use private package sources. So for instance, maybe you have NuGet packages that are private. Maybe you have some GitHub packages or Azure DevOps artifacts that are private, and you don't want to put them in the source. You have the ability to configure your setup.NET environment to be able to configure that for you. So finally, we talked about what a GitHub action is. We talked about how .NET developers can take advantage of it. The next thing is, okay, that's great. So where can I deploy to? And what if I told you can deploy everywhere? But Azure App Service is a great option. But there's also functions and static web apps. And even if you want to deploy to Azure Kubernetes Service, you can. But at the end of the day, you can deploy anywhere. We're going to talk about Azure, but you can deploy anywhere. .NET apps can be deployed anywhere with GitHub Actions. I'm going to talk about Azure because I love Azure, but you can also deploy it to Heroku. You can deploy it to Netlify. You have the ability to do that as well.
And I think so, when you think about .NET as well these days, it can really be deployed anywhere, right? Not just Windows, but you've got Linux and Mac as well with .NET Core. And I think for anyone who's maybe not a .NET person by trade and background, that's probably something important to mention there as well.
Yeah, no, most definitely, right? So regardless, through this talk, I talk about a couple of different deployment models for .NET, right? You have a more infrastructure as a service option, or a platform as a service option, or even static sites, right? So you have those abilities to deploy to them, and Azure is just the flavor of a particular deployment model, right? And I think that's a really good point to call out, Chris. So when we talk about deploying to app service, which, if for folks who don't know, is Microsoft's platform as a service offering for web-based applications, there are a couple of things that you might want to consider. So what kind of .NET apps do we want to host in app service? So your traditional web applications are always a good bet. So whether it's .NET Core or .NET 5 Razor Pages, MVC, Web API, server-side Blazor, right? So the very traditional web applications. But there's a couple of great things about app service that makes it really ideal for certain scenarios, right? So if you have if you need scalable production workloads, aka high performance or even dedicated environments, you have that capability inside of app service. App service is great because it's managed, but it's not so managed that you don't get access to some of the more underlying configuration that you might need. So I don't want to worry about patching my VM. I don't want to worry about Windows updates or these sort of things, but I do want to maybe configure some small settings that I would have if I was hosting an IaaS environment, right? I have the ability to do that with app service. And then finally, in my opinion, the greatest feature of app service is slots, right? You get access to slots and VNet support and Azure Active Directory integration. But what slots give you is the ability to have different versions of your app on the same app service. So for instance, maybe you have a staging environment and you have a production environment. You can deploy your code to your staging environment. And then once you've gone through a set of tests, you can just literally swap the slots. And then what was your production environment or what was your staging environment is now your production environment. So think about just the power of being able to easily swap, your deployments in a way that makes sense. So I have a demo about how we deploy to app servers with GitHub Actions, and I'm going to use a friend of ours. I hope you know it. It's called Visual Studio. So you can create GitHub Actions, the complete experience from inside Visual Studio, and I'll show you what I mean there. So in here, I have an application. Let me just make this a bit bigger here. So I have an application that it's in GitHub, and I'll provide a link to that later. But it has 3 apps in it. So it's got a .NET 5 application, .NET Core or .NET based Azure function, and it's got a static site with Blazor WebAssembly. So I'm going to start off by showing you how to deploy a regular old .NET application, .NET 5 application likely, to app service. So it's as simple as right-clicking on our project. So as you can see here, .NET 5, .NET SDK, Web SDK. I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to go to Publish. And what Publish does is it allows us to publish to a particular environment. I've already created a GitHub action already, as I was testing a little bit earlier, but I'm going to go new. So you can select Azure. You select what flavor of app service that you want. Or what flavor of your app. So you can deploy it to a VM or ACR. But in this situation, I'm just going to deploy to app service on Windows. So it's going to go through. It's going to pick out where I want. Let me just change there. All right. So this is an API, so it's hosted by, it's not just a .NET application, but it also has API management hooked into it, so it's not just a typical application. I'm going to select my Azure App Service here, click Next, and then it's going to ask for me for what my API is, or my API management. Select that. Wait for all this to load. Select the API that I'm going to configure my app to point to. Click Next, and then it's going to come to this option. So typically in the past, in Visual Studio, we would just directly created a pub XML file, which is like a publishing profile. But now in the newest version of Visual Studio, and I'm running preview, which is 16.10 preview 1, I believe. That version has the ability to create a YAML file, CI/CD using GitHub Actions. So I click Finish, and then it's going to read through my application, and it's going to build out a workflow for me. So as you can see here, it did some things. It created a publishing profile, secret. And we'll talk about secrets in a second. It allows you to look at the different configuration, and it also comes out with all the different hosting options here. This is great, but maybe I actually want to see what's going on here. I can easily click Edit Workflow, and this is what generates, right? So a completely, fully set up GitHub action deploying our .NET 5 application, as you can see here, to Azure. So it has all these sorts of environment variables here. So the things that I picked out, the name of the web app, and if you can scroll down, it's literally just the workflow walks through all of the steps needed. So when I said that I would talk about secrets in a second. So what happens in a situation where you have some connection strings or service principals or some secrets that you don't want to store in your code? You can easily do that in GitHub Actions. So in the GitHub portal, there's a section on your repository for secrets. And then what you can do is you put your secrets in there, and then you reference them using this nomenclature right here, So secrets dot, and that gets you access to the secret that's hosted in the GitHub repository. So as you can see here, I'm not going to drain this what this action does, but it's simple as it does a restore, build, and test, and then publishes, and then it publishes. It takes that output of the publish directory and uses zoom in. Oops. Oh no. Windows.
The demo gods.
See? Oh my gosh, no, it's fine. So there we go. So I just want to zoom in here. So it uses an Azure Web Apps -deploy GitHub action. So this is a GitHub action that's built by the Azure team to deploy to app service. So after it does that, it configures it. It also, in this situation, this API uses Swagger. So it generates a Swagger file for us and then imports that Swagger file to our API management. So everything that I would need to do manually is done for me in an automatic way. And all I have to do is just commit that, and then on that commit, that run occurs. So then that happens. Awesome, right? So I think one of the things to call out here is that this is a pretty simple scenario. We can continually configure this our heart's consent. So one of the things that I love doing right here is, for instance, maybe I want to specify a target framework, right? So I could easily have access to all the GitHub, the .NET CLI commands right inside of here, because these are just running commands at the level. As you can see here, scrolling up a little bit, I missed over this. So this runs on Windows-latest. I could easily change this to Ubuntu latest, but then I would have to change probably some things in here to make that work. Maybe, for instance, if there were some path variables that were accessed or things like that, probably up here, I'm guessing. But at the end of the day, I can configure this to my heart's content, and they're working on it, but there is a good amount of autocomplete too. So as you can see, I can specify what my run is. So Windows latest. It also does a little bit of IntelliSense, as well as, I guess you could say, linting for the GitHub Actions as well. So that is deploying, configuring end-to-end a .NET 5 Web API to App Service, which I think is super, super cool. So I'm going to go back to our slides here and talk about what's another deployment option that we can do for .NET apps. So we can deploy to .NET to Azure Functions as well. For folks who don't know what Azure Functions are serverless, stateless workloads that exist inside of Azure that you can run small tasks on. There are durable functions which give you the ability to configure state and have longer running or multi-step functions if needed. But for the most part, your typical Azure function is, I need to run this little bit of code when something happens, and then I don't need to do it ever again. I don't need to maintain state. A good example is, for instance, what if you get an HTTP request to do something, and then that HTTP request is massaged, and then maybe you write an entry into a database, right? Great example. Some other examples are maybe you want to listen for an Azure blob that gets updated. You can then do work on that blob and then go about your day. One thing that's really, really important to call out about Azure Functions is that app infrastructure doesn't matter, right? So it's a serverless configuration or serverless environment, which means that you don't have access to the underlying infrastructure or whatever. You can still configure your app, but the limits to what you can configure are basically scaling, right? So think of things, if you have event-driven architecture, triggers, bindings, non-HTTP things, that's a great example that you want to use Azure Functions for. Like I said, Azure Functions has HTTP support, so you can use HTTP triggers. But for non-traditional, non-HTTP things, event-driven architecture solutions are great examples to use Azure Functions with. And my favorite part about Azure Functions is they're extremely cost-effective. So extremely cost-effective that there are very, very large companies with very, very small Azure bills because they do a lot of work with Azure Functions. Yeah. So an important thing to call out.
Yeah, and I think the other point as well you made there about the event-driven side of things, like that is super, super important in the world that we live in today as well. When you think about things like, I've got a message or I've got some event that needs to trigger some other service and all these different microservices that we want to connect with each other, rather than having that, application server that's just running and just all it's doing is constantly listening to see if there's a message coming in. The fact you're able to bind it using functions is really awesome. And like you say, very cost effective. It's a nice approach.
Yeah. I like, I like to tell people, if you have an application that doesn't need a UI, think of using Azure Functions, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's connected to the web at all, or it's connected to something that's connected to the web, and it does need a UI, even if it does need a UI, like, I've written Azure Functions that actually serve static content, right? So in a very, very small sense. But if you don't have a UI or you don't need a UI, look at Azure Functions to take advantage of, because I like to call Azure Functions basically console apps in the sky, right? Like this concept that you can run a little bit of code and then you never have to see it again, and then until it runs again. So I wanted to show you how easy it is. I'm going to use Visual Studio again, and the process is going to look very similar. But I wanted to show you just how easy it is, right? And the configuration is a bit different. So here I have a typical, your world's most famous weather forecast demo, right? I want to deploy this to Azure Functions. So same thing, right-click the project, go to Publish. I'm going to go New here. I'm going to select Azure again. And it's going to detect what kind of application it is, because that's what Visual Studio does. But the options are different now. Now it says, oh, you want to deploy an Azure Function app, and we're going to pick Windows in this particular sense. It's going to ask me for what my resource is in Azure. And then the same experience, right? CI/CD using Actions workflow. Click Finish. Wait for that to generate. And there again, a very, very similar experience. If I edit the workflow here, you can see that the code that was generated, the YAML file that was generated is a little bit different, right? You still have, your build, test, publish, but then the last one here, and I'll zoom in, Azure Functions Action. So remember when I said that the Azure team has built GitHub Actions for almost basically everything, right? This is an example of that. So we saw web apps earlier. This is functions. There's ones for Kubernetes. There's ones for static web apps, which I'm going to show you in a second. So it just goes to show you that you don't have to build all this stuff by hand. And look at all that it's asking for, right? All it's asking for is app name, a publishing profile, which it actually generates for you, and then the package path. Right, so super, super easy. You don't have to do this stuff by hand anymore. And I think that's a really important thing to call out.
It's interesting. Like I'm sat here really engaged on this demo as well, because when I do stuff with GitHub Actions and do my deployments, I'm usually using VS Code, and VS Code is a brilliant tool. I'm so used to using it now day in, day out, and I don't often use Visual Studio. So some of this intelligence and cleverness behind the scenes, which is picking out which services you want to go and deploy to and generating the workflow. This is all actually brand new to me, so this is really, really interesting, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, the tooling for Visual Studio is quite good, and they're only making it better, right? I think one of the things that they see is, okay, so obviously there are templates that it provides you, right? But then once you have the template that actually works, it's not like it's a template that you have to then put a bunch of stuff into. I can commit this code right now, and it would immediately start to kick off an action that would actually deploy. Yeah. It's not like I have to then, make a bunch of changes to make it to work. All the things are there. The only thing that I would need to do in some scenarios is create secrets, which you can actually do inside of Visual Studio as well, which I think is super, super cool.
Nice.
So finally, So finally, Azure Static Web Apps, or Azure SWA. So the folks that don't know what Azure Static Web Apps is you don't need a server. Like we mentioned a little bit earlier about a situation where if you don't need a UI, right? So you can use Azure Functions. But what if you need a UI? But you also, you're just serving static content. You're serving HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You don't need a server at all. You can put all of that on a thumb drive and then have that thumb drive available somewhere, right? So Azure Static Web Apps gives you a framework for you to be able to host static content. And one of the things I love to tell people is that Blazor WebAssembly is static content after it's built. So what ends up happening when you do a .NET build or even a .NET publish on a Blazor WebAssembly application, what happens? You get a folder with a bunch of JavaScript in it. Right? So it takes your C# and then it transpiles it down to WebAssembly, right? So super, super awesome. And one of the great things about Azure Static Web Apps is, what if you do need a server? Okay, well, then why wouldn't I use a traditional app service? Well, you need an API. So you have a static website that maybe makes an API call to say, get the weather, or some other really cliche demo that I'm about to show you. You want that API and your code to be in the same place, but the UI is not. It doesn't need to use this. It doesn't need access to the server at all, other than making API calls. So with with Azure Static Web Apps, the API itself is actually tied in with the application. So there's two pieces to Azure Static Web Apps. There's the front end, which is completely static, and then there's an optional API backend that you can use. One thing that's also really, really cool, I'm going to show this demo, and I love showing it, is that the CI/CD for creating an Azure Static Web App is actually done inside of the Azure portal. And then finally, free SSL certs, right? So, how many times have you built an application and then, oh, I need to be HTTPS, so you have to go get a cert from a free source, or maybe you purchase a cert, but it's challenging. Like, you have to go and do something else, and then you got to drop it into a different, into somewhere in the Azure portal. By default, Azure Static Web Apps are all HTTPS, so you don't have to configure certs at all. The certs are free and they're available. So I want to show you really, really quickly. Did you have a question, Chris?
No, I was just saying how awesome it is, and I've started playing with static web apps lately myself as well, and they are so good. So I'm looking forward to the demo where you show how easy it is to everyone to get going.
Yes, so I'm going to show you how to get started with Azure Static Web Apps, and it's as simple as going to the Azure portal, right? So I'm in the Azure portal right here, and I'm just going to create an Azure Static Web App. Click that. I'm going to click create. And then it's going to ask for some stuff. I'm going to just put it in some random folder. We're going to call this test demo. I'm going to specify a region, West US 2, because that's where I live. I'm going to provide the source of where my code is. So one thing that's really important to call out is that with static web apps, the expectation is you have some code. In this situation, I have this code in GitHub. So I'm just going to click continue here to authorize it. Authorize. And then what it's going to do is it's going to load all of my GitHub repository information into the Azure portal. So I'm going to choose my organization. I'm going to choose Isaac Levin, which is my organization. I'm going to choose my repository, which is .NET Conf Demos. And then I'm going to specify the branch, which is the main branch. So the next step is, okay, so so you showed me where your code is. Can you tell me what kind of app you're deploying? So there's these build presets which exist, right? So you can deploy Angular, React, Svelte, Vue.js, Gatsby, Hugo, but there's a Blazor option here. So you select Blazor, and then the three things that you need to configure as it pertains to your build details is where's your app located in the code base, where's the API located in the code base, and then where does all this stuff get built out? So let's go over to my code base really quick. So this is my code base. And as you can see here, if you go to the Azure Static Web App or the Static Web App folder, I have an API and I have a client. And then I have the shared folder, which is kind of shared information between the two. So I know that I need to put everything's in a Static Web App folder. So I need to change this a little bit. So we'll change this to Static Web App. I'll copy this there. Copy that there. And then you can click preview workflow file, and this shows you in the Azure portal what the GitHub action that's going to get generated looks like, so you can validate it. So as you can see here, it's taking advantage yet again to another GitHub action that the Azure team has built, right? Oh, I zoomed in really far there. So Azure Static Web Apps -deploy. And as you can see, all this information that we provided is here. So Static Web App client, Static Web App API, and the WW root. So if I create this, what's going to happen is it's going to create my resource, and then it's actually going to kick off a build. So once this is done, this doesn't take very long. Deployment in progress. Wait for this thing to finish. Waiting. Usually doesn't take this long. While this is, yep, there we go. Go to resource. So as you can see here, so I can look at the workflow file, I can look at the deployment history, I can look at the code base itself, and then I can look at the URL that gets created. So I'm going to hop over to the Azure or the GitHub Actions page of the GitHub portal. So as you can see here, I have a handful of apps that are running, right? So Azure Static Web Apps is the one that I have here, and I can click on it, look at the build and deploy job, and then look at while this is starting, it'll populate all of the logs of all the things that it's building out here. So one of the things that I'll just do for the brevity of time is I'll do this to one that already exists. Let's do that one. All right. So it lists me all the individual steps that we saw earlier. So build and deploy. So it says it gives you, so it utilizes RX, which is an internal tool by Microsoft that's open source that allows us to build out these things. It detects that it's .NET, and then it runs all this stuff, right? So I have the ability to do that. And then if I scroll down to the bottom, it gives me my URL. So I can go to this URL. I just clicked it. This is a Blazor app, right? But it's hosted completely statically. So this API is going to take a second to run because it was cold. But this is a .NET application running on static web apps, so it's completely static. So the only thing that's dynamic is this call to the API. But this is all JavaScript being run in the browser, right? So super, super, super cool.
Awesome.
All right, so let's go back here. Go ahead.
No, awesome. Looks really good.
Yeah. So to summarize, where are we at, right? So so there's a great solution to configure CI/CD on your GitHub repos, right? That's one of the things I really want to call out with GitHub Actions. And building and deploying .NET Core apps is painless, and the provided workflows are extremely valuable. There are some workflows that I didn't even know I could take advantage of until I looked into them a little bit and said, oh, I could definitely use that for some of my workflows. There's a plethora of custom workflows, like I said, to many Azure services as well as services all over the spectrum of development. So please take advantage of the marketplace and especially look at some of the ones that are offered for our Azure services. And finally, use GitHub Actions whenever you want to deploy ASP.NET Core or .NET 5 to Azure, period, hard stop. Right? So I want to thank everybody for hopping on and taking advantage of talking with me about GitHub Actions, Azure, and .NET. So if you go to this URL, isaacl.dev/actions-.net-azure, that'll take you to a short link with access to this deck, access to the code base, and some other auxiliary information that you might find valuable. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So Chris, thanks for having me. If anybody has any questions or we want to chat, let's do it.
Awesome. No, that's great. Thank you, Isaac. I think that was a great session and a great overview there of GitHub Actions and how they help with .NET and Azure. I guess as we kind of wrap up here, are there any particular things that you've learned along the way that you think, oh, I wish I knew that before I started, or any kind of tips and tricks to get going? I think one thing I've learned for sure with all of this is just the power of Visual Studio. Like I say, I'm a big fan of VS Code, and that's been my main editor for such a long time, but it makes me remember, right, I need to give VS some love occasionally and check in what's going on there.
Yeah, one of the things that I can show you too, for the folks who maybe haven't played around with GitHub Actions, there's a couple of things that you can use inside of VS Code that makes your life a bit easier too. So I can actually just show that. Let me just share my screen. So if you have, if you're using Visual Studio Code, there is a really, really cool extension that I use called GitHub Actions. And it allows you to look at your workflows and what the current running is. Oh, that's kind of funny. But it allows you to see the status and some of the logs for your GitHub repos that are running, right? So instead of having to go out to the Azure portal, you can take a look at them, right? So look, these are the logs that are coming from GitHub, and I can see them right in Visual Studio Code, which I think is super cool. And you can see some of them are aired out, and that's cool too. Also, you have the ability to look at your secrets, so you can create secrets here. You can create secrets, or you can manage your self-hosted runners, which I think is also really, really cool, right? So if you don't want to go to the GitHub portal, you can manage a lot of this GitHub Actions, I guess you can call them workflows, like creating secrets, looking at logs, even, and I showed you earlier as a part of the demo, creating the actions themselves. You don't need to go to the GitHub portal for a lot of it, which I think is super, super valuable.
And I think that's one of the things I like about VS Code is where you've got all of these extensions that kind of plug into things, it does start becoming a bit like Teams is these days with a productivity perspective. VS Code is becoming this hub for all of your development activity as well. I use GitHub Codespaces myself a lot as well, and being able just to have all of that there, the extensions pop up, is really awesome. So no, that makes sense. Cool. Good stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love talking about GitHub Actions. So, for folks that want to know a bit more about GitHub Actions, I did actually recently talk about GitHub Actions for desktop as well. So .NET Desktop. at the latest .NET Conf Focus event, which is in February. People don't talk about CI/CD for desktop apps very much, but there's definitely a CI/CD story for desktop, and you could do it all with GitHub Actions, which I think is super cool. Again, like it's literally just running code somewhere else that's not your machine in an automated way, so you can literally do anything.
Absolutely, and I think that's something we were sort of talking about just before we went live, but I think a lot of people think about DevOps, and just straight think up, right, let's think of a web app or let's think of this scenario. But like you mentioned, desktop apps, one scenario, data and all of these other scenarios. We're seeing lots more kind of data science scenarios where people are bringing these DevOps processes in. And I think, there's certainly actions out there. And I think that's, I don't know about your opinion, but I just love the whole idea behind GitHub Actions, where effectively all these different actions you can use is just another GitHub repository, right? And I think that whole idea behind GitHub and this idea of open source and community is really cool. And the way that it builds on that is a nice way of expanding what you can do with the platform. A really nice, elegant way of doing it.
Yeah, and for folks that, maybe you're looking at a particular scenario, right? Like there's over 7,000 GitHub actions, right? Like maybe you want to take advantage of a GitHub action, not a good example. Maybe you want to take advantage of being able to publish to the Windows Store. Maybe you want to do that. I mean, that's something that if you want to do. I think one of the things that I think is really great about this too is it's all about building community, right? So a lot of these things, if you take a look at just some of these, let's just take a look at some of the ones that are Azure based, right? So Azure Machine Learning Compute Action. You have the ability to run Azure CLI commands inside of it, or scan your registry, or set the context of your kubectl commands. Like it's not just as simple as deployment, right? It's everything that's involved in the continuous integration and continuous deployment of your app, right? You need to get your app from one place to another. It's not just as simple sometimes as building and then, pushing it somewhere. Maybe you need to do a lot of other stuff. Maybe you need to do some security scanning. Maybe you need to deploy some database stuff in MySQL, right? I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is the workflows are available for everybody regardless of what you're trying to do. And if you feel like, hey, there's something that I always have to do, and I imagine other people have to do it too, create a GitHub action on the marketplace. It's free to do, and people can download them for free and give you feedback, and maybe you can find out some different ways to do things too.
Awesome. Excellent. No, really great summary there, Isaac, and thank you for that. Good.
Yeah, no
so
problem.
I think that covers us for the session. I think that was some great information, some great insights around how people can go ahead, use GitHub Actions to go and deploy their plethora of .NET apps. We're not just thinking about those web apps and ASP.NET, all of those different types of .NET applications like Blazor or the desktop apps. There's a way to go and do that. So definitely go and explore GitHub Actions and find a way to use that. Excellent.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Excellent. So Isaac, thank you for joining, and once again, just want to make sure we plug your Twitter and your was it Twitch as well that I saw earlier as well on the page.
Let's go all the way to the back. Hold
there we
on.
go.
So so I stream on Twitch every Wednesday about open source stuff. Not doesn't do anything to do with .NET or Azure or GitHub Actions. I talk with people in the open source community about what they're doing and learn and have great conversations. So last week we interviewed, actually it was this week, we interviewed somebody that I met on Reddit named Sankyet, and we talked about being an open source contributor, writing open source software, and I found out a couple of new projects, which I think is really, really cool. And we have a pretty good schedule of folks coming up too, which was super cool.
Awesome. So for anyone, when the audio is up for the podcast version of this, Isaac R. Levin is who you want to be following there. So check out his details, because plenty of excellent content coming out there.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you having me on to chat with you and your folks here. And, let's continue the conversation. Let's chat on Twitter. Let's chat on any mechanism that you want about how cool, GitHub Actions are and how you can use .NET to deploy it anywhere, but especially Azure.
Absolutely. And I guess the final thing before we close here is continuing the conversation. We're going to be having you back, I think, in May to talk about application insights as well and the monitoring side. And I think it's
that'll be fun.
A continuation, right? Because when people think of DevOps, they often think CI/CD and deployment, but monitoring is absolutely a part of that story as well. So I think continuation of the story there.
Yeah, live ops is definitely a thing, right? So, for folks, tune in to that in May. And, I love talking about App Insights. I've been talking about App Insights for as long as I can remember, right? I was one of the first people, I feel like, to use the platform. At least it feels like that sometimes.
Gotcha.
But I think it's super, super fun. Like, it's great talking about telemetry with folks because nobody really, I guess you could say, nobody thinks about how cool telemetry is until they see it in action. Yeah. And I think that's really, really valuable.
Awesome. So no spoilers. We'll leave that until the next session we have in May. So Isaac, thank you again for joining. Been a pleasure.
No worries. Awesome. Thank you again, Chris.
So there we go. What a brilliant session that was, and hopefully that's inspired you to go and take a look at GitHub Actions, .NET Core, and ultimately deploying your workloads to Azure. Because as Isaac mentioned, you have so many choices and opportunities there, whether it is using GitHub Actions to deploy to AKS or app servers or static web apps or more, or even your desktop applications and getting those deployed out with the binaries using GitHub. There is an option for you. So there are plenty of ways that you can start your journey here. So thank you once again, Isaac, for joining the show. It was brilliant to have you on. And you know what I'm going to ask. If you enjoyed this session, please go ahead, like the episode, hit subscribe, and also hit that notification bell so you know as soon as there is brand new content. And it's not just this main series, of course, as well, of content that I'm focusing on. If you're the type of person who doesn't have a lot of time and you prefer bite-sized episodes, then go ahead and take a look at my new Cloud Drop series. I recently released a session all about how Git works behind the scenes, and that's being really well received by the community. That's been getting a lot of views and a lot of likes. So if you prefer to see the bite-sized content, let me know, and then I can make sure I prioritize that. And again, if there's certain types of content you like, hit the like button so we know to prioritize that as well. So Isaac will be joining once again in May as we go ahead and talk all about application insights, telemetry, and observability, which of course is a huge part of a DevOps or a LiveOps process. So until then, you can catch me on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and of course, www.cloudwithchris.com. On cloudwithchris.com, you can go ahead and listen to the shows as well as read the transcripts as you go as well. So with that, stay safe, stay healthy, and until next time, all I have to say, thank you for watching. Bye for now.